Hi again, welcome back to the Scandinavian History Podcast, with me, Michael Schenkman. Last time, Norway lost the war and had to enter into a union with Sweden. Even though the Norwegians didn't get the independence they dreamed of in the spring of 1814, things could have been much worse. Bernadotte chose to be lenient in the negotiations and allowed the Norwegians to keep their radical constitution from Eidsvoll more or less intact, as long as they agreed to sign on the dotted line and agreed to the union. During the whole process of waging war against Norway and later making sure to rope them into the union, Bernadotte was the crown prince of Sweden, while his ailing adoptive father, Karl XIII, was still officially the king. Today, we'll see what Bernadotte got up to once he inherited the throne for himself. Episode 128, Revolutionary Marshal, Reactionary Monarch. In February 1818, Karl XIII died and his adoptive son ascended the throne as King Karl XIV Johan. It wasn't a radical change for the new king though. He'd more or less been running the show since 1812 when Karl XIII suffered a stroke and could no longer function normally, let alone run a country. You might think that becoming king would have been the crowning achievement of almost any career, especially one that began in relatively humble surroundings in a French provincial town. But Bernadotte had resigned to this fate more than dreamt of it. To begin with, he'd nourished dreams of returning to France after the fall of Napoleon. He'd hoped that he might have a shot at the French throne, and there are some speculations about this influencing his lenient attitude towards the Norwegians in 1814. If he'd shown himself to be a magnanimous ruler, merciful in triumph, this would reflect well on him compared to both the old Bourbon dynasty and the new Napoleonic one. But in the end his hopes were dashed when the Bourbons were restored to their pre-revolutionary throne. On the other hand, his fears of being removed, like all the other Napoleon-era appointees who had occupied thrones all over Europe thanks to the ascendancy of France, weren't realized either. Instead, he was allowed to settle into his role as the ruler of Scandinavia. Still, as far as Bernadotte was concerned, it was no doubt second best. Many years later, Bernadotte said, "I was once a Marshal of France, but now I'm merely the King of Sweden and Norway." He never really adjusted to his new life in Stockholm. To begin with, he never learned to speak Swedish, even though he eventually learned to understand a fair bit of it when it was spoken around him. Once, in 1812, when he was still a newcomer to Scandinavia, he had tried to give a speech in Swedish, transcribed into French spelling to help him pronounce the words. But it had been a disaster. People had snickered. After that humiliation, Bernadotte never again tried to speak Swedish in public. Instead, he relied on his son, Oscar, to deliver important speeches, just like he did last time when the two of them visited the Storting in Christiania. Since the king didn't speak Swedish, everything had to be translated for him. Proposed legislation, reports, newspaper articles, everything had to be translated into French. This also meant that Bernadotte became reliant on courtiers who could speak French. Lucky for him, he had a close confidant and aide, Count Magnus Brahe, who could speak French. Count Brahe remained unmarried, so he was free to devote all his time to the king. He lived in a 10-room apartment at the royal palace and attended to the king all day, every day. He was often the first person Bernadotte met in the morning and the last to bid him good night in the evening. Anyone who wanted access to the king had to go through Count Brahe. Amazingly, though, he never seemed to have taken bribes or otherwise exploit his close proximity to the king. The language wasn't the only aspect of life in Sweden that the new king struggled with. He couldn't stand the food either. Bernadotte wasn't a picky eater, but he had grown up in France, and the Swedish cuisine didn't agree with him. He would often find the dinners inedible and would order a boiled egg or omelette off menu. He liked his omelettes with mushrooms, and he was amazed that Swedes didn't really eat mushrooms. It was considered poor people's food, fit for those desperate enough to rummage through the forests to find something to fill their bellies. As if the food situation wasn't bad enough, Bernadotte never adapted to the Swedish drinking culture either. His beverage of choice was wine, and he drank it mixed with water. He didn't like hard liquor and couldn't stand the Scandinavian habit of taking several shots of vodka with their meals. He hated the smell of alcohol and would instruct his courtiers to douse people who smelled of booze with perfume before they were admitted into his presence. But of all the things he disliked most about Sweden, it was probably the weather that took the cake, especially the winters. During the cold winter months, the indoor temperature at the Royal Palace in Stockholm rarely rose above 15 degrees. I'm told that's roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit. To cope, Bernadotte slept in a small bedchamber with a roaring fire going at all times. He'd also stay in bed for as long as he could, frequently not getting up until the late afternoon. That meant that he'd take meetings with courtiers, politicians, generals and other officials while he was still in bed, wrapped up in his duvet. The papers made fun of this habit, calling his reign the bedchamber regime. But whatever he thought about being the king of Sweden and Norway, his subjects were generally inclined to like him when he ascended the throne that winter day in 1818. Bernadotte was even reasonably popular in Norway, where people still remembered his willingness to accept their demands for far-reaching autonomy from the last episode. Many Norwegians also appreciated that he took the time to have a coronation in Norway as well as one in Sweden. On September 7th, 1818, he was crowned King of Norway in the Cathedral of Trondheim. That was the first time a king had been crowned in Norway since Christian II in 1514. None of the later Danish monarchs had bothered with a Norwegian ceremony. Also in Sweden, people with liberal leanings admired the way Bernadotte had treated the Norwegians, and they hoped that the new king would choose to limit the power of the crown in Sweden as well. In terms of foreign policy, he largely lived up to the high expectations placed upon him. He kept both his kingdoms out of wars, something of a novelty for both Swedes and Norwegians. The king insisted on strict neutrality in all continental conflicts during his reign, saving both lives and money. And that was sorely needed, because the economy of both his kingdoms were, quite frankly, a bit of a mess. And the wars of the last decade were largely to blame for the abysmal state of the national finances on both sides of the Scandinavian mountain range. As king, Bernadotte prioritized stabilizing the Swedish finances, and he did so with a neat trick that benefited himself personally as well. You see, during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had conquered the French colony of Guadeloupe in the West Indies. These islands were then handed over to the King of Sweden when the country joined the coalition against Napoleon as compensation for land that Bernadotte lost in France when Sweden went to war against his former homeland. But the Swedes didn't even have time to take control over the islands before Napoleon was defeated and the restored Bourbon monarchy demanded to get the islands back. Guadeloupe was handed back to France at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, but as compensation, the Bourbons recognized Bernadotte as the crown prince of the United Kingdoms, even though he'd been one of Napoleon's marshals. In addition, the Swedish king received 24 million francs, which was a boatload of cash at the time. Bernadotte generously gave this money to Sweden to pay off the national debt, in exchange for a perpetual yearly stipend corresponding to the interest on those 24 million francs. The King of Sweden actually still received this annual boost to his personal finances from the government, so it was a pretty good deal for Bernadotte and his descendants. And it wasn't his only smart financial move. He was quite savvy, buying up farms and businesses all over the country, using both his own money and public funds. Much like Gustav Vasa in the 16th century, Bernadotte doesn't seem to have been too bothered about separating his personal money from the crown's. Anyway, beyond financial stability, Bernadotte also understood the economic growth required investments in agriculture and infrastructure. During the first decades of the 19th century, the biggest infrastructure projects in Sweden were the building of canals. Remember, this was still in the pre-steam engine days, so traveling over land was still a pain in the neck. But if Sweden's existing waterways, lakes and rivers could be connected by canals, heavy goods could be moved much easier on barges than on carriages. The first of these canals, the Södertälje Canal, is a 5-kilometer-long waterway that connects Lake Mälaren with the Baltic Sea, bypassing Stockholm. It was inaugurated in the presence of the king in October 1819. The second, and much more ambitious canal, was the Göta Canal, cutting Sweden in two, creating a waterway from the Baltic Sea in the east to Gothenburg on the west coast. Already back in the 1500s, Bishop Brask suggested the construction of this canal, but at the time, Sweden didn't have the resources or the know-how to carry it out. By the way, if Bishop Brask sounds familiar, that's because he is the bishop who survived the Stockholm bloodbath by hiding an objection under his official seal on a document attacking the archbishop. If you don't have the foggiest idea what I'm talking about and would like to refresh your memory, go back and listen to episode 70. Anyway, in 1810 they finally started to dig the canal, one of the largest construction projects in Swedish history. It took 22 years to finish, and the 190-kilometer long waterway was inaugurated in 1832. Mind you, only 87 kilometers consist of dug canal. The rest is lakes and rivers. Bernadotte was there for the opening this time as well, showing his support for the endeavor. Even though the Göta Canal has had more of an economic impact than the Södertälje Canal, it never gained the importance its supporters hoped it would, not least since they started to build railways in Sweden only a few years later. Today, Göta Canal still operates, but it's mostly used by tourists who cruise from coast to coast, watching Sweden peacefully glide by. Or at least that's the fantasy. In reality, navigating the 58 sluices in the canal can probably be quite stressful, causing tension on board. It's not for nothing that the canal is also known as the divorce ditch. Beyond all of this, Bernadotte also promoted the writing of a new civil and penal code, and compulsory primary education was also introduced toward the end of his reign. Even though the immediate economic benefits might not have been obvious to everyone, literacy would turn out to be crucial for industrialization and economic growth in the second half of the 19th century. The Swedish population also grew quickly during Bernadotte's reign. In fact, within a few decades, the Swedish population was as large as the combined population of Sweden and Finland had been before the Russian conquest. But everything wasn't hunky-dory. Far from it. As a young man, Bernadotte had been a radical, a revolutionary even. That's not particularly strange, considering that he had the revolution to thank for his stellar career in the French army. But a lot of time had passed since then, and his circumstances had changed somewhat. As the years passed, Bernadotte grew increasingly conservative. By the time he took over the thrones of Norway and Sweden, he was a proper arch-reactionary, happy to wield autocratic power, distrustful of anyone and anything that smelled of radicalism or even liberalism. His own son, Crown Prince Oscar, on the other hand, was inspired by liberal ideas, but whenever he tried to convince his father to try some of them, Bernadotte rebuffed him, saying he'd lived through the French Revolution. He knew what kind of chaos and suffering could be the result of regular people getting too much power or too many crazy ideas about liberty. With time, Bernadotte even grew rather paranoid. Each evening, his chief of police would report the latest rumors in Stockholm to him. At night, guards were posted throughout the palace, and the doors leading to his bedchamber were all locked. In that bedchamber, he always had a safe filled with cash in case he'd have to flee the palace all of a sudden. One of the specific threats Bernadotte feared was Prince Gustav, the son of Gustav IV Adolf, who was ousted in a coup in episode 122. Bernadotte knew the former crown prince, who was the same age as his own son Oscar, still had supporters in high places in Sweden. He was so worried, in fact, that he collected all the evidence he could find pointing in the direction that Munch, and not Gustav III, had been Gustav IV Adolf's biological father, meaning that the exiled Prince Gustav had no claim to the Swedish throne. Bernadotte planned to publish this dossier if the Gustavians would ever try to threaten his position in any way. And Bernadotte didn't just collect intelligence and compose secret dossiers, he also acted forcefully against those who dared to express opposition to his policies. In 1812, a new Freedom of the Press Act was passed by the Riksdag. Technically, the new law had been passed in an unconstitutional way, but the government managed to convince the estates that it was so important to pass the law that they'd let it slide. The new Freedom of the Press Act limited the freedom of the press from the Age of Liberty. From now on, the king had the authority to close down newspapers he didn't like. Bernadotte used this right frequently. The July Revolution in France in 1830 fired up the imagination of liberals all over Scandinavia, and this scared the king, even though he didn't shed many tears for the toppled Bourbon dynasty in the country of his birth. To cool the revolutionary fervor in Sweden, Bernadotte exploited his authority to close down papers who spread these dangerous ideas. By the way, they must have seemed extra dangerous considering the fact that the king couldn't understand any of them. He only received translations and interpretations from his courtiers since he couldn't read Swedish. The most famous victim of the king's willingness to fight the press is the paper Aftonbladet, which published its first issue in December 1830. It was a moderately liberal paper, not Republican or even particularly radical, but the king didn't like its irreverent tone, or the fact that its readership was growing, soon surpassing the most conservative publications. Aftonbladet was published in the afternoon, enabling the reporters to include items from the morning papers, as well as news that had arrived to the capital with the Morning Post. Aftonbladet also paid their reporters more than other newspapers did, thereby attracting a lot of talented writers. Within a decade, Aftonbladet had a readership of approximately 100,000 people daily. Bernadotte feared the paper's influence and ordered Aftonbladet to be closed down. But to the king's annoyance, that didn't mean the problem went away. It didn't take long for the paper to reappear, but now under the name the Second Aftonblad, technically a completely new newspaper. When also the Second Aftonblad was closed down, a third one appeared in its place. Aftonbladet was closed down no fewer than 25 times, making a mockery of Bernadotte and his authority, until the king's power to close down newspapers was eventually abolished. But it wasn't just in the press that Bernadotte faced opposition. There were a number of increasingly critical voices also in the estates. In the first decades of his reign, the king's supporters in the Riksdag, not least his confidant Count Brahe, managed to keep the opposition in check, but things started to change and get out of control in the late 1830s. The years 1838 to 1841 were the most volatile during Bernadotte's reign. It wasn't all his fault though. These were years characterized by bad harvests and a general recession, which led to hunger and poverty. In Stockholm, no fewer than 1 in 6 of the inhabitants were so poor they needed assistance from the city to make ends meet. That kind of situation obviously bred political discontent. It only required a spark to start a fire, and that spark came in the summer of 1838. In the pre-industrial age, summers were always the most dangerous times, politically speaking. The previous year's grain supply was almost up, and the new harvest hadn't been turned into bread yet. People were hungry, and the weather allowed them to congregate in the streets and be angry together. It's no coincidence that both the 1789 and the 1830 revolutions in France broke out in July. But the spark that lit the fuse in Stockholm in July 1838 wasn't hunger per se. Instead, it was the news that the publicist called Magnus Jacob Krusenstolpe had been sentenced to 3 years in prison for insulting the king. Krusenstolpe had written an article criticizing that a friend of Crown Prince Oscar's had received a coveted military promotion, bypassing an older and, in Krusenstolpe's view, more qualified candidate. To make matters worse, the decision had been made on a Sunday, thereby violating the law forbidding work on the day of rest. The conviction of the popular Krusenstolpe, in combination with the widespread hunger and poverty in the capital, turned out to be the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back. Violent riots with thousands of participants broke out in Stockholm. The king thought his worst fears were coming true and immediately called in the army. Even though a massive military presence kept things more or less under control, rioting broke out every now and then throughout the summer. It all culminated in the evening of July 19th, when a mob of at least 2,000 people, many of them drunk, showed up at City Hall, where Krusenstolpe was kept. People screamed and smashed windows, preparing to break in and liberate the prisoner. When military units showed up to dissolve the mob, rioters threw rocks at them. The rioters didn't even back down when the soldiers fired in the air. In the end, the soldiers were ordered to dissolve the mob using force, which they did, shooting into the masses of rioters. Dozens of people were injured, but all things considered, it's surprising that only 2 people died. The following day, martial law was declared in Stockholm. But even though calm was restored, that didn't mean that the king's troubles were over. During the Riksdag that followed in 1840 to 1841, there were rumors of a coup that would force Bernadotte to abdicate in favor of his son, the popular and liberal Oscar. In this climate, the king was forced to agree to at least some liberal reforms. Most importantly, he had to give cabinet ministers more authority, making them heads of ministries. Before, they'd only been the king's advisors. This was enough to defuse the immediate crisis, and since Bernadotte was pretty old by now, the opposition was content to just wait until nature would do its thing and clear the way for Crown Prince Oscar. Meanwhile, in Bernadotte's second kingdom, Norway, we see a similar trajectory, but with an extra layer of complexity. First of all, the financial situation in Norway was even worse than in Sweden. As we've seen in previous episodes, the war years hadn't merely been a burden on the local economy, it had caused an economic collapse and literal starvation. Now, the national debt was crippling, and it was basically impossible for the Norwegian government to get international loans, because their new currency was trusted by exactly no one, not least because the inflation was out of control. In an attempt to stabilize the currency, the newly established National Bank of Norway decided to connect its value to something tangible, namely silver. The idea was that every single bill printed should correspond to a certain amount of silver kept in the vault of the bank. That's a brilliant idea if you want people to start to trust your paper money. There was just one tiny little problem with this decision. The National Bank didn't have nearly enough silver to actually provide this guarantee. To fix it, a new silver tax was introduced, forcing ordinary Norwegians to hand over their silver. Unfortunately, most Norwegians didn't have any silver to contribute, and those who did weren't overly keen to part with it. It took until 1825 for the National Bank to have enough silver in its vaults to calm the markets down, and not until 1842 did they have enough silver to back up the guarantee printed on the banknotes. The silver tax did stabilize the currency, but it led to another problem, namely deflation. Deflation is the opposite of inflation, and it means that money increases in value instead of losing value. That led to people choosing not to part with their money, since just sitting on it made you richer. This in turn slowed the economy down, causing prices to fall and making it very tricky to get bank loans, halting investments needed for the economy to grow. Norwegian merchants dependent on the international markets were particularly hard hit. It became difficult to export their wares when the Norwegian currency was growing increasingly expensive. The lumber industry was hit hard and saw many bankruptcies. It didn't help that high export tariffs were also introduced simultaneously. The taxes, deflation, bankruptcies, and the bureaucracy in general led to a growing opposition against the way Norway was governed. Especially merchants and farmers in southeastern Norway were annoyed. In 1818, it led to protests among the farmers, who marched on the capital and demanded that the Storting do something to improve the situation. Riots broke out in the capital, and in the end the military was called in to re-establish order. Hundreds of farmers were arrested, and their leaders were sentenced to time in prison. But cracking down on the riots didn't solve the problem. The economic crisis remained. It would take decades for the Norwegian economy to recover. This could have been a really dangerous time for the people governing Norway, but luckily for them, they could shift the attention and frustration of ordinary people away from themselves and onto the king in Stockholm and his attempts to undermine Norwegian autonomy. As we saw last time, Bernadotte had been lenient in the negotiations with the Norwegians in the fall of 1814, accepting most of their demands when the union was established. But, as I noted already back then, despite the Swedish worry that Bernadotte was going soft on the Norwegians, it was all a part of his long-term strategy. Once he was king, he started to try and limit Norwegian autonomy, step by step. To get his way, he didn't limit himself to the regular political channels. Bernadotte also cultivated a network of agents and favorites in Norway, and bribes were handed out wherever they thought it could be useful. For example, Bernadotte had encouraged the peasant revolt in 1818, hoping it would weaken the Norwegian political class and thereby helping him to increase his influence over his western kingdom. Concretely, he fought with the Storting over a number of issues that had seemingly been settled as part of the negotiations of 1814. To begin with, Bernadotte demanded that he be given an absolute veto over laws passed by the Storting. According to the Norwegian constitution, the king only had the power to delay laws that he didn't like, but if a new Storting passed the same law 3 times, it would take effect even if the king still opposed it. A case in point was the fight over the Norwegian nobility. Bernadotte wanted to be able to ennoble Norwegian subjects, officially to make Norway equal to other nations, but really to be able to create an upper class that would be loyal to Stockholm and the crown, melding the two kingdoms together. The Storting didn't want that, both since nobility was seen as an anomaly in an enlightened state, and because they wanted to keep Norway separate from Sweden as much as they possibly could. So, in 1815 and 1818, the Storting voted to abolish the aristocracy. Both times, the king vetoed the law, but since he could only veto twice, the law was passed in 1821 against his will. Bernadotte also wanted the power to appoint and fire cabinet ministers, the right to rule by decree when the Storting wasn't in session, which was only for a few months every 3 years, and when the Storting was in session, Bernadotte once again demanded the right to appoint its speaker, thereby controlling the parliamentary agenda. In addition, he wanted to limit the freedom of the press granted by the 1814 constitution by reintroducing the old Danish censorship law from 1799. But Bernadotte was fighting an uphill battle against the Storting. They flatly refused to change the constitution, at least in the way the king demanded. The Norwegian attitude has been known as constitutional conservatism, and it served the Norwegian ruling class well. But who were the members of this ruling class? Well, simply put, Norway was still governed by the civil servants, just like it had been during the years of Danish rule. This system, known as the bureaucracy state, where the civil servants held a dominant position, had come about because Norway didn't have the kinds of people who usually hogged most of the power. Due to the climate and topography, Norway had few rich landowners, there was no nobility to speak of, and the merchant class, never particularly strong, had been severely weakened by the prolonged financial crisis. So the civil servants basically controlled all three branches of the government: the courts, the government, and the parliament. Far from all of them were politicians, though. They served in a number of capacities, such as clerks, officers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, priests, etc. This meant that they were found throughout the country, and they had quite a bit of influence on the local communities where they lived and worked. Even though they were everywhere, their numbers were still relatively small. In 1814, there were only 1,800 of them, and in the year 1850, there were still only about 2,000 civil servants in Norway. That meant that they made up 1 per mil of the population. That's 1 in 1,000. Still, during this period, 1814 to 1848, they held roughly half of the seats in the Storting, giving them far more influence over Norwegian politics than their numbers would suggest. Even though they performed different duties in Norwegian society, many civil servants were united by a vision of them as the backbone of Norway. In a political context, it was up to them to modify and purify the popular will of the people, because only they, the civil servants, had the required education and wisdom that farmers and the lower orders lacked. Until 1842, it was forbidden to campaign for political office in Norway. The reasoning behind this was a fear that campaigning would give people with special interests a way to power. Instead, the best suited should rule, and the civil servants obviously thought that meant them. In practice, it created a class of clearly defined and hierarchical political aristocracy in Norway. Just like the nobility in other European countries, the Norwegian civil servant class mostly socialized with each other, their children married other members of the same class, and sons of civil servants followed in their father's footsteps career-wise. This elite was distinctly Norwegian, even though, paradoxically, many had foreign roots and little or no connection to the Norwegian majority peasant population. Again, quite similar to the aristocracy in many other European countries. This Norwegian pseudo-aristocracy was the exact opposite of the new nobility that Bernadotte had dreamed of creating, and it did what it could to stop all his plans to forge closer ties between Sweden and Norway. The university in Christiania became a center for the civil service and their cultivation of a Norwegian national identity. The university had been established in 1811, supported by Christian Frederick and in opposition to the Danish authorities, who preferred Norwegian civil servants to study in Copenhagen to make sure they internalized the correct Danish perspective on how to run Norway. In 1815, the first 8 students obtained their degrees, and by the 1830s, over 100 students graduated annually. Until 1845, 2,200 students got their BAs, and most of them moved straight into the civil service. The most common degrees were theology, with 780 graduates, law, with 1,059, and medicine, with 280 graduates. Needless to say, the lion's share of these students were the sons of civil servants. Naturally, the civil servants had a lot of cred among people in general. I mean, what 19th century peasant wouldn't trust their local doctor or the parish priest? They increased their legitimacy further by playing the nationalist card, framing themselves as the defenders of Norway against Sweden. But as the years went by, regular people started to complain about corruption and abuse of power. It also irked some people, especially people of means but little or no political influence, that the civil servants had formed this elite class that did what it could to monopolize political power, keeping others out as much as possible. Still, internal tension within Norwegian society could mostly be papered over in the first half of the 1800s, since the major political conflict could be framed as the one between Norway and Sweden, instead of rulers and ruled in Norway itself. The king helped to reinforce this narrative by fighting the Storting and the Norwegian government throughout the 1820s. But toward the end of the decade, his power started to slip. Until 1829, the Norwegian Council of State, basically the cabinet, had been led by a Swedish steward. But from 1829 onward, a member of the council presided over it. This meant that the government was run by Norwegians, even if they had been appointed by the king in Stockholm. Just like in Sweden, the relations between the king and parliament reached a breaking point in the second half of the 1830s. In Sweden, it happened in 1838, and in Norway, due to its election cycles, the crisis erupted 2 years earlier, in 1836. Even though Norway didn't have a parliamentary system where the government needed the support of the Storting to stay in power, the Storting still had the authority to impeach members of the Norwegian government if they violated their duties of office. This power could also be used as a weapon against the king, and that's exactly what happened when Severin Löwenskiöld, known to you and me as a member of the Union Party at the Eidsvoll Assembly, was impeached. He was seen as a strong Bernadotte ally and therefore convicted for having supported the king in dissolving the previous Storting before its delegates felt they had been finished. After that, Bernadotte stopped fighting the Storting and more or less gave up on his attempts to tie Norway closer to Sweden. The Norwegian constitution, the most liberal in all of Europe at the time, had withstood the king's attempts to undermine it. It had successfully served as a bulwark protecting Norway from royal encroachment. The Norwegian civil servants now reigned supreme. By now, Bernadotte was an old and tired man. He'd lost the will, or at least the ability, to struggle with the opposition, both in Stockholm and in Christiania. Paradoxically, as soon as he stopped fighting the politicians, he was rewarded with popularity. When he marked his silver jubilee in 1843, after 25 years on the throne, he was celebrated with enthusiasm by his subjects, both in Sweden and in Norway. And why shouldn't he be? Compared to a generation before, his subjects were now much better off. Sweden and Norway had enjoyed peace for a quarter of a century. The population in both countries was growing dramatically, but thanks to improvements in agriculture, there was enough food to feed everyone. In fact, most years they could even export a surplus. The economy was also helped by a rapidly expanding industrial sector as well as financial stability thanks to dramatically reduced national debts and stable currencies. Taxes and tariffs had also been reduced, but nonetheless, because of the growing economy, the crown's revenues had increased. Of course, not all of this was thanks to Bernadotte, but he was the man with the top job, so he got the credit. When he died the following year, he was genuinely mourned. He had a stroke in January 1844, and even though he lingered for a few weeks, he never recovered. Ever the businessman, Bernadotte discussed his personal finances to the very end with his confessor, Johan Jacob Hedrén, who, in addition to being a bishop, also happened to be the director of a bank. The business talk went on so long that the bishop/bank director didn't have time to administer communion to the dying king one last time before he drew his last breath on March 8th. He was succeeded by his only son, Oscar, who became King Oscar I of Sweden and Norway. We'll get back to him, but next time we'll turn our attention to Denmark and how the Danes were coping with the loss of Norway. If that's something that interests you, I recommend you tune in. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Scandinavian History Podcast. If you did, please consider leaving a stellar review, or at least 5 stars, on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This is an excellent way to attract new listeners and to support the show. If you crave more content related to Scandinavian history, I recommend you look up the show on social media. For instance, you can go to facebook.com/Scandinavian History Podcast. Via the Facebook page, you can also send me questions or angry messages about things I've said or not said on the show. If you prefer the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me and send me messages at Schenkman. That's SHAINKMAN. And if you've abandoned it in favor of Blue Sky, you can find me there as well. I look forward to hearing from you.